Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome back to this second episode in a series that Geoff Thompson and I together are calling Two Ordinary Boys with Extraordinary Lives, in which we're exploring what we're calling our miraculous lives that we've experienced, and we've both written a lot of that story in two books. Jeff's book is called The Divine CEO, and mine is The Secret of the Alchemist. And coincidentally, or not, they are both being released on July the 31st. So if you go now, please go to Amazon, if you wouldn't mind, be so kind, and to pre-order The Divine CEO and The Secret of the Alchemist. We'd be thrilled if you could do that. And the reason we're recommending each other's books is because we've both been, Geoff, immensely moved, I think, by reading each other's books, and amazed by the similarity in the core.
I kept saying to my wife, "This is exactly what I say. This is exactly what I say. I've got to get this for the kids."
So if you find that you can tune in better to Jeff's resonance and his frequency, then read his book. If you find that doesn't work, you've always got my book to fall back on as well. So between us, Geoff, we've got it covered, hopefully. In episode 1, for those of you that haven't listened to it or seen it yet, strongly recommend you pause this one now and go back and have a quick listen to the last episode, because in that Geoff particularly is talking a lot about his origins and how he particularly managed to face fear and the depression that came on the back of those fears, and how he worked his way through some of that, which he explains in his book, The Divine CEO. And also, I think, Geoff, that both you and I believe that it doesn't really matter what stage you're at in life, both from an age point of view, but also from a spiritual journey point of view. It's actually never too late.
No, it's never too late
to begin, even if you feel that you've sort of began once and it's halted and you want to restart, kickstart. Then maybe this is a moment for you. Maybe you can become the alchemist in your world again by some of the things that Geoff and I hope we're going to be able to share with you. Our core message, everybody, is that there is a power called unconditional love, which infuses the whole of the universe and our lives as well, that we can all draw on to become the people that we truly are meant to be. We can find the treasure. We can find our true empowerment in life. We do not have to settle ever, Geoff, for second best.
That's very true. That's very true, yeah.
Okay, so Geoff, I finished the last episode by throwing out a little challenge for you, which I hope you were able to pick up, which is, I did read in your other book, which I will just mention again, Notes from a Factory Floor, the factory being in Coventry, where we were both born and grew up a few years apart, literally in almost the same neighborhood. One of the things that I experienced, and I'll talk about mine in a moment, I want to question you about what you say is one of your greatest fears was the fear of rejection from your mother, the person who you had your first relationship with of any description.
Yeah.
And so do you want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I can give you the arc of that as well. I stood on nightclub doors where people tried to kill me. You know, four of my friends were murdered during the time I was a doorman. So I am used to confrontation, but I was more terrified when I wrote my play, Fragile, about being sexually abused and about trying to talk. It's about a guy on stage, one single guy on stage, talking to a tape recorder because he can't trust anybody, not even his own family, especially his own family. And he's trying to relate to his mother about how he was abused and how that affected him and how the world seems to have denied what happened to him. And I was more afraid when I put that play out, and there were more forces trying to stop me putting that play out. Most of them coming from me and forces around us. I can't tell you how fearful I was. And I'll come to the conclusion of it in a minute, because we have this idea that we have a mundane fear. I fear my wife, I fear change, I fear my mother, or I fear rejection, or whatever it is. But what the play enabled me to do was unravel that. So I had this tremendous fear that if I disappointed my mom, or if I wrote the wrong thing, that she would withdraw her love. Because obviously when we were kids, that's what most mothers do. They tell you off. With you, it was very severe. She put you in a cupboard. With me, it was just a withdrawal of love. That filled me with terror. Now my mom, I love her bones. She wouldn't have even known she was doing that. That would have been the way she had been taught to parent. That's the way she parented. But it left me as a sensitive kid with a sense of I'm going to lose the love of my mom. She's going to abandon me, and I'm going to have nothing. And it felt like an existential fear. It felt like I was climbing out of a dugout with a bayonet going into no man's land. It was no less than that.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've got comparisons, so I knew the nature of it. I started to write about it peripherally, and then I started to sit on the nerve of it and actually put it, I wrote a play called Fragile that I tried to get on everywhere in the country. No one would touch it. The only place I didn't want it on was in Coventry. And I said, I'd had an offer, and I said, no, not Coventry. If my mom saw this, I don't want to hurt my mom. And the only place that would take it was Coventry. And God was saying to me, Belgrade Theatre.
Yeah.
Hamish Glenn was very brave and put it on. Yep. We actually had Samaritans at the door every night when we put the play on, because it was seemed to be so volatile or so sensitive. So what the play showed me was I had this tremendous fear of being abandoned by my mom. And in the play, the character, and in the book, and in all the things I write about, the character always confronts all the people he thinks has hurt him, all the people that have abandoned him, and he asks them, why did you abandon me? And of course, one by one, I was able to dismiss them all. The person that abused me, the person, my dad, my mom, the police, my family, my friends, I really was tilting the lance at everybody. But when I honed it right the way down, it was specifically about my mom. And that was the red herring. My ego had said, this is the problem. She's the problem. Unless she changes, you can't be healed. When I got to the level of my mom, all I found was unconditional love. My mom loved me so much, and I'd been distracted. And I realized that wasn't what I was afraid of at all. Sorry. Am I back? Something happened then. I wasn't afraid at all. I wasn't afraid at all of my mum abandoning me. As Julian of Norwich said, that all of our mundane fears are distractions. I was really afraid of being abandoned by God. And of course, that was the one thing I couldn't say. All the other things I could play around with, I could tilt a lance at. But when I came to God, and I was so angry with him because he'd let this situation happen to me as a kid, because I'd been sexually groomed and abused by this particular person. And when I finally got down to God, when I got past of all the other people and recognized how much I loved them, overwhelmingly loved them, and how much they loved me, I was just me and God. It was a one-on-one. And he said to me, you think I abandoned you? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, I didn't abandon you. Did you abandon you? And it just was like, wow. Well, yeah, of course. I've been distracted all over. I've been abandoning myself all my life. That was the fear I had, Colm. The fear that God was going to abandon me. But God is the absolute. He's the constant. And I am part of that. And when I merge with it, I am that. So, of course, I can't be abandoned by what I am. But there can be a perception of abandonment.
Yes.
So I love but to get to that, I had to go through all of these levels of fear. It's like climbing down the 9 circles of Dante's Inferno.
Yes, absolutely.
Until I got to the bottom and recognized there was nothing there other than a conceptualization that had sent me around the houses saying, don't look at this. Because that part of me recognized that if I look at the fact that it's not really my mom, it's not really my abuser, it's not really my dad, if it isn't the phenomenal things or the mundane things, or the physical things in the life, then it's got to be just one thing, which is God. And when you meet God, he immediately assures you that you cannot be abandoned. You cannot be abandoned. You can pretend you've been abandoned. There can be a perception that you're abandoned, but you can't be abandoned by what you are, any more than a fish can be abandoned by water. He might not even know what water is, but he can't be abandoned by it. So when I got there, I had this conversation with God, and I just felt this overwhelming care and comfort. And after the play, man, I just was falling over myself to look after my mum, to hug her. I was teasing her, and all of the fear for my mum disappeared because I recognised that that wasn't the fear in the first place. And the fear, the real fear I had, wasn't real either, because God said, you know, I'm not going to abandon you. I am you. You are me. So, but that did determine my life for a long time, and I had to have the courage to look at that. Had to give myself a platform to say those things, even if not directly to my mum or to my dad or to society. Not even if I didn't say them directly, I could say them through a character. I needed to say them in order to discredit them. Either they've got to qualify themselves or be discredited.
What age were you when you went through that that metamorphosis, that catharsis? When did that take place?
That was in my late 40s. So it took me quite a while to get there, but I'd written about all of these different things. I was too scared to sit on the nerve of, I want to talk about my mom. I want to talk about my dad. I want to talk about the person that abused me. I want to stop avoiding that. I want to look at it. I want to absorb 99% of it. I want to intercourse with it until it's completely gone. It's this sense that it is a three-dimensional monster. When you embrace it, it becomes a two-dimensional cartoon. And when you completely immerse with it, it dissipates because it has no reality. But you have to have the courage to absorb 99% of it first. And then when you do, there's nothing left.
Can I give this another context as well? Because that's you eloquently, Geoff. And are we able to still access your play Fragile? Is it published?
Yeah. It's published. Yeah, you can get it. It's probably the most brutally honest thing I ever wrote. And I said all the things I wanted to say through a character, and I said them. I didn't spare anything. It's visceral. Well, you're reading the book, so you know how visceral I get and how honest I am. But that was the only way for me to transcend those fears, was to completely bring them out into the open, the head, the body, and the tail, so that they could be dismissed. What we bring into light becomes light. There's no longer a discussion. It just comes into light. You see its full form and you go, that's not real. So what is it that I'm afraid of? And as Julian of Norwich says, we only fear one thing. We fear abandonment from our source. My mother isn't my source. My mother is my mother. My dad isn't my source. Society certainly isn't my source. God is my source. And he can't abandon me, and he won't abandon me.
So what I'd like to do, just briefly, is take the other angle from a broader psychological, theoretical perspective. But in my book, I talk a lot about Professor Carl Jung, and his theory of psychoanalysis. And many people have studied Carl Jung, so those of you listening may already know this. But for those who don't, Professor Carl Jung was a colleague of Sigmund Freud, and between them, really, they were the fathers of modern psychology. And one of the emphases that Carl Jung placed in the human psyche was the role of the unconscious. And Carl Jung says that the unconscious is the home, is the abode of most of our fears, of most of the thoughts that we repress, that you were just describing then, the abuse that we've received that we don't want to face, the dragons in the shadow self that we prefer to ignore, and everything, as you say, is a distraction to prevent us from going into the unconscious and finding them. And in his theory of psychoanalysis, he encouraged people to visit the unconscious and to face those, the dreams particularly, but also those apparent realities that, as you so rightly say, dissipate once they're brought out into the light. So for me, you're quoting Julian of Norwich. The person I tend to quote quite a bit is a guy called Thomas Merton.
Yeah.
And Thomas Merton sadly passed away last century, but he was an advocate. He was a monk, a Catholic monk, but also a great writer, and his books are freely available still, and still a great inspiration. But he talked about this journey called the Dark Night of the Soul. And if you compare Merton's talking about the Dark Night of the Soul, and you talk about Carl Jung's visiting the unconscious, they're pretty much the same thing. And the journey that you made to realize that all these elements, all these distractions, your mother, your father, your society, your family, all the things that you thought you feared losing, were just shadows of the real sense of loss, which is the sense of loss of God. So for me, when I was in my mid-20s, I had a dragon that would rise up in my life that was pretty angry, that I despised, that I didn't want to manifest in my life. And I was self-aware enough, fortunately, because of the spiritual work I'd already done, that I wanted to deal with that dragon. I wanted to face that dragon. I really wanted to put that dragon to bed once and for all. And to do that, I actually went into, consciously, I went into the Dark Night of the Soul, where I allowed God and love, unconditional love, to just accept all of the components of myself that I despised, that even I would go as far as to say I hated about myself, that I considered worthless, that gave me that overriding sense of lack of self-worth, that lack of respect for myself that I didn't have. And I just confronted them head on. And I would go out every lunchtime when I was working, and I went round the back of a parish church down in Dorset, and I would take my little packed lunch with me, and I would spend a whole hour every day just allowing myself to fall into the pit, into Dante's pit of despair. I consciously allowed it to happen. But before I did that, I did ask at the beginning of each session, was that unconditional love would be conscious to me, until I got to the very darkest point after, say, 6 months, it must have been, where I didn't even have a sense of love being present. I had no sense of God being present. So the fear that you talk about, and that I also had, which is this complete separation from love in its purest form, happened. And it is a really, like you say in your play, you almost need the Samaritans at the door. I had a couple of people who I'd asked to sort of stand with me, and I would meet with them every couple of weeks and tell them what was going on. And if it got into an emergency situation, a really, a darkness, I was on the phone and saying, hey, can you just pray for me, because I need this right now. But I deliberately went into that place. And what I discovered was this young boy, and he was very, very angry. And I think it's the same angry boy that you talk about, in your experience as well. And that angry boy was angry like you because of what his mother did. So my mother was an epileptic. She was an undiagnosed epileptic when I was a toddler, around age of 2 or 3. And when she sensed a fit coming on, to protect me, she would push me into the cupboard under the stairs. So this was long before anybody wrote J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter, by the way. So I later discovered I was the original Harry Potter under the stairs. And she did that to protect me. But as you can imagine, as a toddler, that was just terrifying. And it was dark. There was no light in there. And I don't know how long I was in there for, because as a toddler, you've got no sense of time. But it felt like eternity to me. And then eventually she would open the door. And by the way, I'd hear all these noises going on outside, screaming and terrifying things going on. And she'd open the door, and then she'd chastise me for playing a game, like, oh, you're hiding in there. Come on out now. You don't need to hide in there anymore. And I was like, okay, what's this? So I grew up very confused. And the thing was, and I'm going to talk to the guys listening. It's not exclusively guys, but Geoff, let's just talk to the guys listening here for a moment. So many of us have that sense of anger, and particularly in relation to our female relationships to women. This is a real danger zone that is becoming almost an epidemic in our society, right now, is that a lot of guys, for reasons that they probably don't even know or understand, because they've never been taught or never been trained to understand these things, out of that shadow self, out of that unconscious, projecting that sense of abandonment onto their female relationships because of their original relationship with their mother.
Yeah.
And I strongly counsel any of you guys listening right now, if you can go and talk to somebody, if you can talk to a counselor, if you pluck up the courage and swallow your pride just for 1 second, accept the help on offer, and save the lives of those around you and save yourself in the process from any further destruction or abuse, then please listen to what we're saying, because we've been there. We
and there's
understand.
a way out, isn't there, Colm?
There's a way out, guys. And the way out is to allow other people to hold your hand for a while.
Yeah.
And to show you that this is not an extraordinary event that's going on in your life. This is something many of us have shared, and there is a way out. And if you're just prepared to do the little bit of work, that little bit of self-awareness, and get the help you need, then you can. In my case, I moved on from that place of complete desolation. So I allowed myself to be in Dante's Inferno, where I couldn't even see the light of God at all. Because then I found the true little boy, and I discovered why he was angry, and I discovered that he needed help. And I then got help in the form of in my case, I did Primal Therapy, which is a form of rebirthing, which was a counseling technique which helped me enormously and got me through that period. And in my book, I describe this process in the metaphor of the early alchemists, where they go through the black phase in the laboratory and then move on to the white phase in the laboratory. And during that white phase was when I was able to learn to embrace the angry child, to console the angry child, and discover that actually that angry child is the me that everybody said they loved in the first place, Geoff. You know, it's the so you
just
and I
stasis.
you and I are just two boys here. We are those boys. We're able to sit here today and talk about this because we have been prepared to put in the effort and the work, and it is work, everybody. But we've put that
and that's
effort
why we
in,
write the books.
And that's why we've written our books. So our
books, the books, we're leaving some trail for people, aren't we?
Okay. So tell me, you have this concept in your book, The Divine CEO, about the divine sword.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about the divine sword?
Yeah, the design, as you start to expand your conscious net, in other words, as you start to reclaim parts of yourself, so parts of yourself are locked up in cognition or perception, darkness, ignorance. In Buddhism, they say all our problems stem from ignorance. So as we start to educate ourselves with these parts, as we start to evict these shadows, we start to win spiritual siddhas. I think you would, in the alchemist, you would call it, was it magic you would call it?
Yep.
Yeah, so we start
omens and synchronicity.
Omens and synchronicity. So you start to get siddhas. So you're able to start witnessing miracles. So one of the things I learned from this contraction was that as I started to expand, I started to experience a lot of siddhas, a lot of miracles. Is that what you was asking about this?
Yes,
specifically about the siddhas? Yeah, and the
absolutely.
divine sword.
Yeah.
So the divine sword was one of the siddhas, and the divine sword was this ability to discern. So because I got more of an awareness, I wasn't looking at everything through dark filters. I was starting to see things clearly. So I could clearly discern what someone's intention was, whether they were aligned, whether they weren't aligned, whether they were in character or whether they were authentic. I could see masks. I could see agenda. And I could also, because I had access to truth, because I had access to love, anything that came up, I could stop it immediately if I drew out my divine sword. So it was the sense of alignment. It was like Aaron's rod. Aaron's rod represented the alignment between the lower and the higher soul. Once you get that alignment and you're in the center, you radiate love, and everything around you is affected by that proximity. So it's like you've woke up and you suddenly start to see that most people are living kind of robotic type lives. And most people there is an agenda going on all the time. about what's in this for me. And it's all fear-based. It's all about trying to survive. And you start to recognize that. You start to see it. So if any negativity approaches you, you can kill it dead with alignment, with certainty, with the divine sword. You can just cut it down immediately. Sometimes you cut it down just by being silent. See, when you get that silence in between, that's the constant coming through. So the divine sword is your access to the constant, but you still have to have the courage to use it. So sometimes when a negative situation starts to manifest in your life, you still have to have the courage to say, that's enough. Don't go there. That's not what we're going to do. Or to make somebody qualify something. Because people tend to speak all the time and quote, and their rhetoric is just what they've recently read in the newspaper, what they've seen on the television, what their friends are saying.
Yeah. And
they mostly have unqualified beliefs. So the moment you ask them to qualify it, they can't really go, even one layer deep. So the divine sword enables you to walk through the world, a bit like when I was on the door, when I was a nightclub bouncer. I had a sword then. I could stand in the queue, Colm. I could stand at the front of the queue when you're letting people into the nightclub, and I could look down the queue of 50 people, and I could scan down, and with my divine sword, I could see who was going to cause trouble in 5 minutes and who was going to cause trouble in 2 hours. I could tell by their actions, by their body language, just what I could just see it. So I would often walk down the queue and say, we can't let you in tonight, I'm sorry. And I would kick people out for something that they were going to do in an hour's time. And they would obviously complain because they haven't done nothing. I said, it's not for what you've done, it's what you're going to do, what I know you're going to do. So we learned to use that sword, and the environment produced that. So when I was working at the addiction centre in Coventry, I was the patron of the addiction centre, and I would go in there. And if you didn't go in there with the divine sword, with spiritual alignment, you would get mullered, because these people were at the very bottom end of society where they had no edit. They had nothing left to lose, and they would shoot you down. And there were energies in that room beside them as well that feed off this kind of thing, negative energies. And you had to go in with a divine sword. You could not go in otherwise. But the idea of going into that kind of environment was to develop the divine sword. What's the use of a divine sword if you don't use it? But, why would you be given a divine sword if there was no use for it? You're given it because it's needed in a specific area. So the divine sword enabled you to see through people like an X-ray. It enabled you to read them. It enabled you to understand them. And sometimes, when I was really acutely aligned, hear their thoughts. And often just be very quiet, listen to them, and allow their unconscious to come through and tell me what they needed to hear. Because I don't know what they need to hear, but they do, and they would tell me. So I would find that people were saying things they weren't aware they were saying. They weren't themselves. Their shadows were talking, and I would be able to say, qualify that. Who is that talking? But the tools, the siddhas, are developed by the environments you go into. So the divine sword is obviously, I'm fine tuning that all the time.
Yeah.
The more clutter I get rid of in my life,
there you go.
The more I lose the ambitions and all the pornographies, the clearer, the more acoustically clear my intuition is. So God will speak to me very subtly, and when He speaks, I act. And it might just be a little thing. He might just say, send this person that book, or ring this person, speak to this person for 5 minutes, stay with this person for 5 years, turn up and it was subtle. So I'll give you an example, if you don't mind.
No, go, please.
I've been invited to do a talk for these kids in the middle of nowhere. When I first got it, my ego pricked up, and I thought, this is going to be good. This will be good for my profile and all the rest of it. All nonsense. This was about 10 years ago. And I agreed to do this talk, and the guy that asked me to do it was very lovely. And I was talking to these bereaved kids, but I was in the middle of a tour, and I was mobbed. I was so busy. When it came to do the talk, I had to travel out of London to do it, because I was in London, and it seemed impossible to get there. And this negative voice was saying to me, it's a waste of time. It's a local event. You should be doing big events. Nobody's going to know you. It's not going to go anywhere. And it was all about selfishness.
Yeah.
Because I was so tired, I fell into the trap. And I remember ringing the guy up and almost accusing him of not giving me enough notice and saying, I would like to come, but I don't think I can because, you know, you haven't kept me in touch. And I remember the disappointment I heard when he spoke. I could just hear the disappointment. I put the phone down and I thought, I've been duped. So I rang him back up and said, listen, I'm really sorry. I said, I'm tired. I'm very stretched. I said, my ego came in. I said, I promised to come and do this talk. And I said, if I have to walk there over broken glass in my bare feet, I'm paraphrasing, I said, I will be there. And he was really pleased, but I nearly got tricked out of it. Anyway, I turned up for this meeting. One of the kids there who was a bereaved kid took a massive shine to me. And I did a little talk, and it was the most local event in the world. If you look up local in the dictionary, you'll see this event. It was so local. There was no profit there. If you were looking at it from a perspective of where's the profit, I turned up. This kid really took a shine to me. I had a good morning with him. Just as I was about to go, they said, we've got another guy that's coming to speak, and it was Nelson Mandela's bodyguard. A guy called Chris Liu.
Yeah, I've heard of Chris. Yeah.
I just thought, what's the chances of that? Anyway, me and Chris would hit it off immediately. I probably only spent half an hour with him, but he had a message for me from Nelson Mandela. He was in prison with Nelson Mandela, and he gave me a message that had been given to Chris, that Chris unconsciously gave me. I had a message directly from Nelson Mandela. Do you know what the message was? Tell your story. That's your job. That's your dharma.
Yes.
And my message to Chris, because I had a message for Chris, was tell your story more. Because Chris was at that time was afraid to tell it too much. If I tell it on the radio, people won't want to get me down to talk.
Yeah.
If I do it in the newspaper, why are people going to invite me to do a talk? I said, if you put it in the newspaper and put it on the radio and come and do local events like this, everybody's going to want to hear you. Because how many people spent time in prison with Nelson Mandela?
Exactly.
And he said to me, Nelson Mandela said to him, Chris, your job is to go out in the world and tell our story, leave the trail for other people. And of course, Mandela's story was just about love. That's what he found. It took him 32 years of torture and all sorts of heinous things that happened to him. And he came out when he left the gates of Robben Island of the prison. He said, if I don't leave any residual hate in this place, if I don't leave here just with love, I'm lost. And that's why this guy became a prophet in our times, I would say.
Indeed.
But that happened because I listened to intuition. My intuition said, turn up here. My ego said, what's in it for me? And the intuition said, that's not how this works. You just turn up because you feel it. The moment you think, what's in this for me, you are lost because it is reduced to the size of you.
Well,
it's just a bargain.
The synchronicity just between us continues to overwhelm me, actually, Geoff, because I've got a story connected to your story, and you're not going to believe this. So for a while, my wife and family and we lived in Surrey, and we'd made friends with two very elderly ladies from the church. And I was really busy with my career at the time, and I was in publishing and traveling all over Europe, selling publishing rights for books and so on with one of my careers. And they said, "Oh, on Tuesday, do you think you and your wife could come for lunch?" And these ladies were in their late 70s, early 80s, and then we said, "Well, we see you every Sunday." And he said, no, but it'd be really wonderful if you could come to lunch on Tuesday. And I exactly the same as you. And I'm thinking, I've got so many important people to meet. I've got so many important things to do. Having lunch with our two dear old ladies. You can hear it coming. There's two dear old ladies, saying. So I said, okay. I said initially, I said to my wife, no, you go. I haven't got time. And she said, no, come on. They're so sweet. We should do this. And I said, oh, okay, all right, okay. I can do I'll have to leave after an hour. That's the max I can do. So we turned up at their house, which was a fabulous place, by the way. And they, as we walked in, they said, "Oh, we've got a special guest, a guy who used to be the assistant priest when he was training here in Surrey, and I turned into the dining room, and there was Bishop Desmond Tutu.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's exactly how it works.
And
The
I'm
ego
like,
says,
exactly
don't
the
go
same
there.
thing.
It won't be big enough.
So
Not
the
big enough for
connection,
you.
let's just put everybody in context here.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela,
Desmond Tutu.
who was Nelson Mandela's counselor most of the time? His confessor was
Desmond Tutu.
Bishop Desmond Tutu.
How strange. How
So
strange.
I felt this big.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a short guy. It didn't matter how short he was. I felt inches tall.
You filled the room,
in the presence of that guy. And we had a fish and chip lunch.
And God has sent him to speak specifically to you, but only if you listen to your intuition.
He did, and which was nothing like you. The mundane is what becomes our treasure. The mundane and the divine, there is no distinction between them. And for those of you who think you've got to leave the ordinariness of life and go off and take some spiritual trip into the outer universe, if that's your impression of what a spiritual life and what transformation looks like, I hate to disappoint you right now, because the spiritual life is lived right here in the now, in the ordinary.
Absolutely true. It's in the it's in the people like you're stepping over every day when you're going through the tube, the kids who are asking for,
But if we draw love, if we draw unconditional love into the mundane and embrace that, then the mundane becomes the most extraordinary, miraculous, magical existence. Geoff, I don't know about you, there isn't a day in my life now that goes by where I'm seeing miracles, quite frankly,
every day,
left, right, and center. So Geoff, the mundane and the spiritual are one of the same thing when you commit your life to transformation and allow.
Well, let's talk about that in the next session. That'd be great.
Let's do that in the next session. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Geoff, again, for joining me today.
Thanks
everyone.